Okay. Chapel assistants, raise your hands. Okay. This is the group that prepares for president. He was the 29th president. Okay.
So today, for this meeting, we have Dr. Gary Dorrien, who is a professor of social ethics at Union Theological Seminary and also a professor of religion at Columbia University. Dr. Dorrien also holds the Reinhold Niebuhr Chair of Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. He has written over 200 articles and 18 books. One of them he discussed today, which is his newest book that was just published last month, Breaking White Supremacy. And also he will be discussing this book at this meeting. Dr. Dorrien is nationally acclaimed. Cornel West has said that he is the preeminent social ethicist in North America today. So without further ado, I now hand the meeting over to Dr. Dorrien, and I want all of us to give him a warm Morehouse and Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel welcome.
Thank you. Oh. Hello, friends. Yes. All right. So how many were there this morning? Okay, that's a good number. There should be something to draw on there, because I was told not to prepare this time. How many of you were here? I think was it 3 years ago? When was the AAR in Atlanta? Was that when we did this? I did this very event. It was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So was there anyone here who was in this group at that time? Yeah, a couple. All right. Yeah, American Academy of Religion was at about the same time, I think, when we did this event last time. I spoke in chapel and then to this group. And when I spoke then, yes, I did give a real talk at that 5:30 event that time, and it came off of this book that I wrote then called The New Abolition, W.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel. And so this book that came out a couple of weeks ago that I spoke about this morning is something of a sequel. It's 2 volumes on the Black Social Gospel tradition, its origins, where it came from, different types, traditions that come together, and so on. The New Abolition book is complex because I've got the whole sort of abolitionist backstory behind it, and then I need to set the table with talking about why it is that we have almost no literature on the Black Social Gospel per se, and why that is so terribly wrong, because this is an enormously important tradition in American religious history that actually provided the theology for the whole civil rights movements, and every famous person you can think of related to it is actually in that tradition, but it doesn't get explicated as a tradition, and therefore really important things, including important people that you discover as soon as you just sort of ask this question. Well, then who were these people who transmitted it from one generation to the next, and who were their teachers and so on? People then come up and then need to be accounted for that historians otherwise just don't notice. So this topic has been an obsession of mine for some time. For 20 years I tried to get someone else to write this book, and my friend at Union Theological Seminary, James Cohn, just kept saying, "Garrett, for God's sake, it's your obsession. Just write it. Just get it over with." So finally I did give myself to it, and New Abolition is a complicated story by comparison to the first one, because I've got the New Abolitionist background and all these historiography questions about what literature has been written and what hasn't been done, and have to deal with all these conventions about what people say when they say why this subject actually doesn't exist, or why I shouldn't be doing this. So I had a more than the usual amount of kind of historiographical stuff to deal with, including just conventions that so many secular historians have about, for example, that religious intellectuals just aren't important past 1899. You might have to deal with them in the 19th century, but once you hit the 20th century, you just don't really have to be asking yourself, well, who are the religious people making an impact any longer? There are plenty of secular historians that just think, that's just a convention. to them. So there are all manner of things that have to be sort of pushed through and problematized, including just the fact that social gospel names something very important in black church Christianity. It's not just in the white churches, where it also names something important. And there, that's Walter Rauschenbusch and the place where I teach, Union Seminary, and all manner of things were impacted by this famous social gospel, and there are shelves and shelves of books on them. And yet, my argument is that the version of social gospel Christianity that's distinct in black churches and among black Americans who are members of the other churches as well, create a religious tradition that is deeper seated, that is more interesting, certainly more important historically and ongoing in a way that other social gospel isn't. So the New Abolition tracked 4 traditions of black social gospel Christianity and gets them in conversations with each other and gets various denominations into a conversation in order to sort of give a sense of the breadth of this thing. This isn't just one stream that I'm following. It's a complex book for that reason. It also means that I don't deal with any one of these strands in a kind of comprehensive sense. You can't. I'm trying to get four traditions into a conversation here. So there's no part of it where I just kind of sink in and just say everything you could say about that. And it made for a complicated first chapter. But my point, always, I knew this to begin with, was that these 4 things are going to start to streamline into something, into a tradition that's going to start to take you in the direction of first Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin Mays and people like that, and then finally take you to Dr. King and his lieutenants in SCLC. So, and that, of course, is a Volume 2 book. So, this is a long-about way of saying Volume 2 is not nearly as complicated in some ways as Volume 1 is, because the whole thing, by the time I've gotten to Volume 2 with this book, is that this is a book about King and his mentors and his lieutenants in SCLC. And, of course, that is, in itself, is complex. There's so much going on. I think it is the great American story. It is also my experience as someone who's been teaching for a long time now and in various places, and I've also gotten around a bit, so I don't just hunker into one place. That when I started teaching, I think I assumed that most people basically know the story, right? And it took a few years of reading papers and so on to just realizing that assumption does not bear out anywhere, right? People don't know the story. I mean, it's only the most publicly, most popular aspects, and they're really just moments. I have a dream and so on. Mostly students do not know, no matter where you go, where it came from, and what happened, what the conflicts were, and so on. I let the narrative run thick and long here, because this is among other things. This book was my opportunity to tell a story that I think just illuminates everything. I don't think there's anything like it. I think, though the book runs long, there's a certain amount of thickness in it that just, there's detail in it that just needs to be told in a book of this kind before it's forgotten. So I always sort of welcome the opportunity to introduce next generation of students to it. The one book sort of leads right directly into the next one. Volume 1, with the book about Du Bois that centers around Du Bois, basically takes you to the doorstep of the figures who directly influenced King. So I've really just sort of led up to and done a little bit of early Mordecai Johnson and Richard Wright Jr. and a little bit of their early work in the early years of the 20th century. But that really sort of put me on the doorstep of being ready to talk about them once we got to the second book. And then that takes me to Dr. King. I had an issue, and this is the last sort of prefatory mark of its kind.
recognition. But I do think Barack Obama is certainly revered by the black community for good and bad reasons. And I think sometimes like that can, because I think Barack Obama's presidency was a certain clouded of many levels of racism and the reality of racism in the country. So it was concerning to see everyone applaud when you mentioned Barack Obama's accomplishments, but the mentioning of breaking white supremacy or the idea of just tackling white supremacy in general did not receive as much as applause. There was minimal applause there. So that's it.
Thank you. Both points. With regard to President Obama, I have all manner of regrets about how especially those first 18 months went, and a good chunk of my book on Obama goes pretty long on what they are. There was a time when I was thinking about this talk flying here a couple days ago. I was thinking I was going to do a little number on that, and then I did just cut that out because I thought, no, that's actually a distraction from what. I mean, all that political stuff and all the arguments you can get into about what didn't happen with regard to the banks and economic policy and sucking up to Wall Street and just everything that you can talk about, well, with regard to sort of disappointments that pertain to that period, really don't pertain to what this subject. There's just something so crucial here that cuts through and transcends all of these sort of political economy or merely political issues. That is what I'm talking about. That in fact, yes, people were out marching and crying about losing their country before he had done a blessed thing. Right? They've already lost their country. And I think that the fact that that was so palpable and real and that it is so telling about what ended up happening and what happened through his presidency in confronting the most obstructionist Congress any president's ever had to deal with. I mean, just consider, there were upwards of 23 Republican votes in the Senate for the DREAM Act before Obama. And the moment we've got him as president, there's 0 Republican votes. And now just barely even remembering that we were that close to the DREAM Act previously. So, I mean, you could mount the examples of what's telling about that, but I thought instead of doing any kind of a dive at all into that stuff that took up whole chapters of my book on the Obama question, that's actually not the issue here anyway. What is here is that we had a gifted, I think, in many ways extraordinary human being as president, and he's the first black president, and gets certain kinds of opposition that no one ever had to deal with before. And regardless of how all the rest of the politics sort of played out, that ended up mattering in a way that delivered, the white lash, the backlash that now we're dealing with. So that's the issue. So just keep it right there and don't get into this, to other stuff in that moment. Especially as when you speak here, you got the clock right in front of you here in the chapel. I mean, you can't kid yourself about not knowing what time it is. Like you look at, oh my God, I need to speak faster because you know how much time you've got left. So I did really stick to something quite basic. So far as the parts about white supremacy are concerned, I do think it is terribly important to be able to name this thing, to talk about it, and not, that, I just push through that. White supremacy is a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what's normal. And it's, in some ways, it's a more radical, it's a more challenging, it's in some ways more difficult to accept analysis than the analysis about mere moral bias, mere racism. Yes, it is all those things, but it also gets at something deeper, more sustaining, more structural than any mere moral bias. And it actually, once you get past people's sort of fear of it and fear of just even talking about anything structural, it can get you to that deeper conversation that's otherwise so difficult to even have in this country. You know, that moral bias way of talking about racism hits a wall so quickly. Just beginning with the fact that virtually nobody admits to the accusation, right? Hardly any. George Wallace claimed he wasn't a racist. You know? And given that fact, it's so hard to then get anywhere if that's all we're talking about with regard to racism, because the wall goes up, and white liberals just want to say, "Oh, I'm not that," you know, I never have been, and just you know, they're just covered with they're being morally justified. And so you have the phenomenon, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr, the greatest social ethicist of the 20th century. There's just not a word in Niebuhr about racism as a structure of power based on privilege, and which is why the worst parts of Niebuhr with regard to this topic, you know, go there, because he only talks about it in terms of moral bias, except the one bad way that he talks about this topic altogether. And Niebuhr does not dare to harm the moral pride of his audiences on this topic. And white supremacy, talking about white supremacy does do that. I mean, I'm offending people's moral pride every week, out there in going on about this. I think it's exactly the breakthrough we need. And there's also there's a danger on the other side of it. Now, I'll just name it. Actually, there was a little bit of it in that talk today, especially at the end. We are now, because of the political moment we're in, we're now witnessing a new season of pessimism. It's called Afro-pessimism, and of just give up, on all that. And that is why I went long about King saying, no, you can't. I get it. Of course, the evidence for Afro-pessimism is overwhelming, right? And yet you can't give into it because the other side of that never changed anything. No revolution was ever based on hopelessness, right? And I do fear that if we just go, as some are now saying, including some people I'm close to, who say, oh, we just needed, that white supremacy talk didn't really work, so we just got to go back to talking about anti-blackness. One implication of making that move is that now we're back to just racism as moral bias that nobody admits they have, and which I think it's going to be just as paralyzing this time as it was last. I'm not saying it's an either or. I'm speaking against the either or. I think the focus on racism is something that is also structural. That's a structure of power based on privilege that needs to be put into play, and where people own up to what privilege they have is a breakthrough that is indispensable, and we've just got to have. We cannot retreat from that, no matter where we are or whether people find it uncomfortable. Yes.
So my question is, how do you, especially in places like Union, how do you contour your talk and contour the analytic of your book to the neoliberal white person who thinks that they are no longer implicated in these structures of power? Because I think now we've come to the place where, especially in a post-Get Out type of world, like, white people are now like, I'm not that white person. I would have voted for Obama 3 times. Like, but you still are benefiting from white supremacy as a structure.
Right.
So how do you talk to white people like that, who think that they are, an ally, when really you are abetting and perpetuating white supremacist logics every day?
Actually, this is far more of a problem for me at Columbia than at Union. And it was when I taught at Harvard. I did Harvard for 3 years on the side, on the bus back and forth every week. And it was, every week I think, wow, I'm not a Union. At Union, there is that sort of no one could get away in class with that sort of neoliberal naivete with, oh, well, you know, we're in this movement, therefore we must be just. Years later. Meanwhile, the thing that is getting through to me is that the civil rights movement is showing me something that my own education and being just doesn't make any sense of at all. That in some way there's some kind of lying going on here that doesn't because what explanations you can get from your teachers, what is that about? It's just it's just trivial. It's nonsense.
So I'm a history major, and these sort of things are really interesting to me. So I have a great interest in how we translate academic writings to pedagogy, whether it be in the classroom or over dinner conversation with with one of our friends. So because of the weight and importance of Dr. King's legacy as formed by the understanding of generations that come past, mine, the other people who sit around the room, what is the best way we can disseminate the truth of the Heaven Raiser and King's radicalization to the everyday person, be it our friends who are in college or whatever? How do we articulate the story that's in Breaking White Supremacy to everyone else who may not read the book?
Yeah, well, I think we've got a moment right now. I mean, just the fact that there's a new poor people's movement going. People are trying to recreate that. Reverend Barber and Liz Theo Harris and the folks gathered around there making that happen. I mean, that's a precious moment because it shows, to begin with, just how you just hurtle right through 50 years. You can just burn from one moment to the next, and it's just the relevance is undeniable. You can see the connection. Oh my God, this is where Dr. King himself ended up, and that this is just where we're picking up with. It's the same dream, and it's virtually the same agenda. So the fact that that's what he was working on, but it's something we're trying to get going right now, is a way of being able to make that that move. To say, well, whatever it is you got in your head about who Dr. King was, this is who he was. He's willing to throw it all in. And it's not like, once you get into what that was, all of his lieutenants were against it. And they're telling him right to the last day, oh my God, the politics don't work here, you're just going to cause a mess in the nation's capital. That's not going to help get us a housing bill. In terms of the politics, they were right. But by the end, King was more radical than anybody around him. He even outflanked Jim Bevel by the end, Bevel was his usual barometer of going too far. And then by the end, he's even to the left of Bevel. Because Bevel's trying to say, are you sure this is going to help the housing bill? And King has said, I don't know. I can't claim that I've got the political angles figured on this one. I just know with whom I need to be. And being about what, right? And so he's actually thrown into the biggest, riskiest venture yet in trying to do this poor people's campaign. And that links us directly, now we've got one going, to him. And I think from there then you can kind of fold it back about how, in fact, this was a great frustration for him. King wanted to talk about democratic socialism. And he was a Christian socialist from Christian seminary onward. I read Rauschenbusch, and that's his worldview so far as that whole constellation of topics goes. And because it's also the same thing that Mordecai Johnson believed, and J. Pius Barber, and Mays, and others. Mays edited a book on Rauschenbusch. So that basic sort of Christian socialist argument is in King all along. And this is just one of those anecdotal things. Incidentally, this is something I knew about way back because the only real mentor I've ever had was Michael Harrington. Was the great American socialist author, activist, wrote The Other America, and the War on Poverty is usually credited to him. And Mike had been a close associate of Dr. King's, and so I had all this lore in my head. About King, and about his socialism, and about just the fact that even all these New York socialists that are in that gang in New York, that were the center of the action in New York, they're all out about being socialists, but they live in fear that it's going to get out. That King is not only sort of in agreement with them in some kind of social gospel, or he's a Christian socialist right down the line. And one of the reasons they feared is they knew, he told them, he wanted to talk about it. He felt that that's actually what's holding him back. is that he can't talk about economic justice in the way that he wants. So it's frustrating to King, and yet, you know, we have all this stuff that, and I put in the book, that pertains to this subject. So once you go from a, you know, what connects us to that Poor People's Campaign, and then the just the passion for economic justice that's underneath it and behind it, that was true of him all along. Then we really have sort of broken the myth of the domesticated king. That is indeed, he's the person we need.
I'm trying to see how I'm formulate this question, but I see that we kind of like paint this picture of Dr. King as like kind of the Jesus of the black community. But I heard you at the luncheon, President's Luncheon today, and you talked about the fundamentals of the black social gospel. And I just want to know, ask you, would you consider Malcolm X like someone who was a proponent of the black social gospel as well?
Great question.
There's certainly things in Malcolm, whichever stage you're talking about, that are just mapped exactly on here. And there are people in SNCC who are always trying to get King and Malcolm together, because they knew Malcolm. Andy Young knew Malcolm. And we're trying to make something happen that, you know, it barely lasted longer than that photograph over there at the time they were together. And that was a regret. And I should say here, as late as December '67, King is still, you know, they've got it. He's got it in mind to. All right, he's got these friends around him who he can see how deeply they admire Malcolm, and he's realizing there's something needs to happen here, and of course he can see that Malcolm himself is in motion, and so he's curious about, you know, how he's turning out. But then Malcolm came out with one of these anti-Semitic statements, and King just, you know, it repelled him. It's like, no, I can't. It's going to be premature to do that. I can't be hooking up with him after he's just said that. Right? And so another moment was lost. I certainly, so far as Malcolm just on his own right is concerned, I think he's by far the greatest in the whole nationalist line. And I'm much more concerned to map this out in Volume 1 than in Volume 2. But the black nationalist line, I mean, that is one version of the black social gospel, period. You know, that just even in the narrow sense construction of that. And I was at some pains to even show in New Abolition that by a broad way of defining what black nationalism is, well, there's black nationalism in all four of these traits. I mean, there's really no black social gospel without you know, the privileging of blackness and of a feeling about Africa and of sort of saying, you know, whatever else we're talking about here, we've got to be talking about black dignity and racial pride, and nothing that gets in the way of that. So all those sort of tropes that are even in someone like Booker T. Washington, you know, his contemporaries have no trouble seeing the nationalism that's actually in Booker T. Later on, it becomes hard to see because, you know, we know how this story turned out, and he's on the wrong side, and yet, you know, wrong side of the Du Bois argument, and yet all four of these traditions actually have a nationalist something, and one of them actually is. It's just, that's what it is. It's the black nationalist tradition. So I'm not going to try to turn Malcolm into a Christian, so he doesn't go into social gospel, you know, rendering any more than I think, you know, Marcus Garvey, who's the next greatest in this line before him. Again, I think, you know, the Garvey movement was actually moving in a direction that would have taken you beyond Christianity. It would have been more of a, you know, Pan-African religion that they were really sort of working on already during the Garvey movement of the early 1920s. So here again, there's a fair amount of Garvey in the New Abolition. I don't need to put him in this category in order to kind of pump up the category. For that matter, even with Du Bois, I mean, Du Bois is the centerpiece of this whole argument revolves around him in New Abolition, because he's the intellectual that all the people in it, the story I'm telling. And I do think Du Bois has a religious, arguably Christian passion that just rings out in every page he ever wrote. The terms of marking out categories, there's a lot in their lives they are attending to, and sometimes in an argument with. And he sometimes says very harsh things about the black church. But I don't have a need to say, oh, Du Bois just belongs to both feet in the black social gospel. He really only has one foot in this story that I'm telling. But he's enormously influential to all the people in it, the story I'm telling. And I do think Du Bois has a religious, arguably Christian passion that just rings out in every page he ever wrote. The terms of marking out categories, there's a lot of black nationalism in Du Bois, including, and I would say in some ways, especially during the period when he and Garvey are in this very, very bitter, acrimony. I mean, you can have a debate as rough as that one got in the 1920s and still be talking about really just two different ways of construing a nationalist hope and, more importantly, a nationalist refusal to be integrated.
Well, just to clarify, it sounds like you're saying the black social gospel is predominantly a Christian.
Well, gospel is a Christian category.
Yeah.
I'm not going to claim it's not, and indeed, social gospel. Yeah, this is something that is it's the gospel. So yes, social gospel is getting the social content in the teaching of Jesus that is in church movements and the like. Obviously, it can go into conversation with, latch onto, be in solidarity with, be in alliance with, whatever, map onto other kinds of cultural, political, religious, sorts of traditions. But and I'm grateful you sort of pushed on this because I am careful in both these books to go. Well, firstly, I just tell you, when I was doing this, deciding how to go narrow and broad, my friend Jim Cohen said, "Gary, go narrow, right? Just make a tight definition and just squeeze it as hard as you can, and just let those people in, right?" And to him, that was what would then make the category live forever, is if you just go kind of narrow. I know what he meant, and I respect what he meant. So that is in there. I mean, I've got a line that it's not hard to figure out who's really coming out best, right? Yeah. But I also go broad.
Right.
So it just goes back and forth, because I think that's the way, that's the most representative way of doing this. I would fear a way of talking about this that just broadens it out so that almost everyone you like or admire would end up in this topic. I don't think that does it any good at all. And so, there is a core. There is a something that defines the thing at its most essential, its most kind of essentialist form. And one way of just testing it, just see the hardcore similarity you get once you've lined out a line of figures that takes you from Reverdy Ransom to Richard Wright Jr. and Alexander Walters and people like that, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., to then the next generation of Mordecai Johnson and Ben Mays and others. I mean, there are terribly important things just being claimed with a kind of life and death seriousness. That is the black social gospel, and I'm sitting there and then saying other things. Okay, it can be very kind of negotiable, but not here. Yeah.
Could you speak about, in terms of tackling white supremacy as a system, what do you think the role white people can or should play in that? Or do you think that's even really possible? Like white people collectively, especially white America collectively, sort of combating this system? And if not, then,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
like, what are your thoughts around that?
We got into this a bit more at the lunch today because I got sort of drawn out on that where I was talking about a culture of atonement. And there, yeah, I was going on about how we're not talking about something that's requires some kind of superhuman moral heroism or anything like that. I mean, just consider an example as prosaic as what the Germans managed in the late 60s and then 70s and the 80s. They actually, in Germany, they built a culture of atonement for their crimes and what they did. And they make sure you have to learn it in school. And everybody sort of deals with it, and it's memorialized in public sites. And it makes a difference, and it's just the kind of culture that everyone else gets to negotiate. When you've just made an assiduous structural institutional attempt to say we're just not going to dodge this anymore. There are crimes of the nation that just have to be confessed and that everybody has to deal with, so that ignorance is just not going to be an excuse any longer. You know, we're owning up to this. And in Germany, they're not unusually gifted or anything human beings, just ordinary human beings who took it on and who resisted it for a long time because there's a whole generation that just didn't want to hear anything about this. You know, just totally in denial because their guilt's up to here, and it's just too much to manage. And yet, look what happened there. So, I mean, that's an example to me. I mean, there's nothing remotely like that in this country, nothing remotely close to it. But instead, we've got, tens of millions of white people who think that they hear it all the time. No, they're so burdened by what they do have to hear, because they never actually dealt with it at all. They still think that their country is the greatest that was ever imagined and could ever be.
And I'm sorry. And so why do you think that is? Like exploring, like what's it about Germany, and what's missing from here in America among whites? Like what's missing? Or right. That's another thing. Like it seems that the U.S. is uniquely. I mean, that's racism is so embedded.
That's right. Sure.
Can America exist?
This is the original sin.
Right? Is the question. Like,
of course,
right?
Is it inextricable from the American fabric? If America very much, which is one would have to argue history that America is not, literally born and birthed in the idea of white privilege.
Right.
So, is black liberation a post-American concept or a post-America concept? And what does that look like for breaking white supremacy? And then does that make breaking white supremacy a inherently, to be honest, terroristic notion? And does that redefine what our idea of what a terrorist is?
I'm not denying this would be harder because this involves an original sin. That is just the social contract, as Charles Mills says, before there was ever a country. Right. And so it does go there. What the book that turned me into a Civil War buff years ago is Edmund Morgan's book, American Slavery, American Freedom, in which he's basically, American Democracy, American Freedom, basically says, no American democracy without American slavery. Right? They grew out of it. And that's a point of intersection at the Civil War where it can take you in both directions, and an argument like that almost in some ways can work better because it makes people, you're all involved in a conversation about something, they all have something in common with, that is the Civil War, and then once you explicate what that is really about and the difference it made and what went into it, then it does open up the possibility of conversations that I think you just didn't have before. But to stick with my example though for a moment, this did happen in Germany. It starts with an intervention, just wanting to say, oh, it's just this horrible Nazi period, right? It wasn't, the good people didn't really think that way, and all this stuff. But then you can't actually do that subject without finding, well, then how did they get that way? And of course, then you are, now the game is on. They have to deal with Martin Luther and all of it. And boy, there's just so much more of it than anybody noticed before in that story as well. And there I have to say, I mean, they have taken it on. That stuff is in the curriculum now too. Germans of the generation today, they get Martin Luther's sins in a way that nobody did before, because now it's just in their curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to stop for a minute. You have got your finger on something very significant. And it is very significant for you in this room at Morehouse College. You see, as I listened to Dr. Dorrien's response to you, he has illustrated at lunch today and now what happened in Germany. I want to redirect your attention just for a moment on this very point, but I want you to focus on South Africa. Bishop Desmond Tutu's, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I wanted to ask you, can that work here? I want you to think about that. I want to say something. In my opinion, one of the things mitigating against a Truth and Reconciliation Committee working in the United States is evangelical Christianity practiced by Orthodox white Christianity, especially, that has significantly crept into Black Orthodox Christianity. I'm going to sit down, but I will not before I say this. Being Dean of King Chapel is not easy, and it's not going to be easy for my successor, because when Dr. Dorrien talks about the Black social gospel, he's talking about Black social gospel ethics, Black social gospel theology, Black social gospel politics,
Right.
Black social gospel justice. Every day when I walk in here and look at this picture, I'm reminded of why they gave me this job. But my job is made more difficult by some of the students who arrive at Morehouse College who don't want to hear about any of those things I just listed. They just want to praise the Lord.
Yes, Dean, yes. Please get into it. Give us a word.
They are not interested in socialized spirituality. They don't want
Yes.
to be a part of a socially aware Christianity. Okay? Now, I could say a whole lot more right here, but I'm going to stop so that you can enjoy this unusual intellectual feast. Help me here.
And they do want to be a part of a socially aware Christianity, but a socially aware Christianity that still includes capitalism, that still includes heterosexism, that still includes patriarchy, that still includes, like, they're socially aware insofar as they get to retain the privilege of maleness, money, and power, the power of blackness, whatever that might mean. But when it comes down to, failing those things, they no longer wish to be socially aware.
The Black social gospel is not finished. It is evolving.
Right.
It is becoming. Because a little bit of the truth that I think I need to share with you, that I know Dr. Dorrien is thoroughly aware of, is that the people he built these books around, the personalities, greatly celebrated at Morehouse for what they achieved. But you cannot ignore the fact that though they fought for justice, they fought for rights, they fought for freedoms, in their time, their fight was limited. Because in their time, as Dr. Dorrien has said to you, in case you missed it, I'm going to put some distress on it right now, they excluded women. They excluded gays and a lot of other difference. Is that reason to condemn them? No. because they had to make some decisions about what they could achieve without giving weapons to their opposition to hit them with. Because the nation was already fertile, looking for ways to oppose them. But now it's your turn. You're on center stage. And the baton is about to be tossed to you. You are the new drum majors. And you've got to evolve the black social gospel so that it addresses all of these things they didn't do so well at. Can I get an amen?
Amen.
So there has never been a time when the struggle just to establish, just to defend that the church has a social gospel mission, that social justice is part of the mission and work of the church, has not had to be fought for. Volume, this is what makes social gospel itself an important category, is it's sort of naming that struggle that's not just in white churches, but in black churches as well. Civil rights movement itself, because it was such a fantastic thing, sort of caused some cultural forgetting about this in many places, and then create a kind of stereotype about many black churches that was only true in certain places. But in this whole story that I told in the New Abolition, I only had one figure who wasn't basically embattled his whole life within the denomination, and very often within their own, just within their congregation. But one exception was Alexander Walters, and he was AME Zion, has just one of those gifted, buoyant, person of such beautiful spirit that just everyone loved him, and people were could therefore take certain kind of critique, attack from him, because people so believed in him and just wanted to be around him. And he was just kind of imbued with a kind of holiness that everyone could see. And he's in AME Zion, and they're just glad to be included. It's tragic. Yeah. So it was a different ride for him, different story for Walters. But everybody else in this story, everybody else has got a story of embattlement, even within their own church. And then that carried on. Of course, Dr. King himself lost his whole denomination and had to get into a new one because his denomination is against the civil rights movement. So I think that just knowing that is a sign. It's not like we're talking about something that's just taken for granted and then maybe kind of falls off. This is something that always has to be fought for. Where was it? Here? Yes.
Yeah, my question was more about the white supremacy and everything that's going on. So I was saying, I was wondering, like, what is the true outcome of having white people recognize the white supremacy? Because at the end of the day, all races have a tribalism about them. So white people recognizing that they have white supremacy doesn't change the fact that they would trust another white man over me. And me being a black person, I would trust a black man over that white man every day. So what I'm saying is, like, do we really have to, like, follow King's message of equality anymore? We don't even have security as a race.
Thank you. I do believe that firstly, I believe that the analysis, that there's such a thing as social structure, and that a structural analysis of racism is profound and illuminating, is true. I mean, there's just first, let's just go to the level of that. We were talking about things that explicate realities that help us understand what we're talking about better. So, before the invention of modern sociology, I mean, there is no coincidence that the social gospel arose at the very same time as trade unions and the development of sociology as a discipline, and social anything. You can put the very language of social justice, the field that I teach, social ethics, all these social anythings you can name, socialism. They all came up at the same time. Right? And this is all a consequence of a kind of breakthrough of what they called social consciousness. Walter Rauschenbusch said, I never had a social idea in my head until 1885, and then suddenly I saw it. I saw the difference that social structure makes, that to have a kind of social view of it. It's not that people didn't see the moral and even social commands that are in the gospel previously, but if you don't know if there's such a thing as social structure, you are just going to understand them in this country in terms of some kind of revivalism, or in terms of pietism, some kind of moralism, where that's just that's all you get out of it. But once you see anything in terms of at the level of social consciousness, I just think it's true, it's illuminating. So first I just want to say on that level, and of course that's what creates the very topic I'm talking about, that there's such a thing as a social gospel. That's point one. Secondly, yes, I've seen it work, and not only that, but I've seen it where I was a college chaplain for 18 years, and I don't know how many anti-racism workshops I've been involved in one way or another, and various kinds of organizing around topics with regard to racial justice, and tried all manner of things that failed. And then some things that didn't fail as spectacularly as the other things. And I do believe that when there are enough sort of white people who at least want to think reasonably well of themselves and need some kind of explanation for how they think the way they do and how it could ever get better, and just as to explain what happened that brought us to this state. As I was saying before, an analysis that emphasizes structures of power based on privilege does illuminate, explains in ways that gives you something that you can work with, that can at least facilitate the conversation in a way that the mere this is just all about anti-blackness, or it's just moral bias, and that's hopeless. I think is hopeless. That you just get stuck there. That's the case. And I am not for that. I am not for just resting with that. Now, there's one more turn to make here, to honoring the way you started that question. And that does have to do with this whiteness issue. I am not sure that there is that whiteness is anything except racism. But we don't teach, when we teach about anyone else with regard to what, human beings are like, theological anthropology and like, we would not accept that verdict for any other group, maybe pertaining to a history, but pertaining to a future. And some of you know this is right where the issue is right now with regard to the whiteness literature. Linda Martine Alcoff has a brilliant but problematic book out there called The Future of Whiteness, in which she goes pretty hard for this, saying we must say that we can imagine a different future for whiteness than the entire racist past that we've known about, and that one clue to why we must not just essentialize whiteness as something that it doesn't have to be is that, for one thing, it relieves white people of any moral guilt and moral responsibility in this area. And secondly, it does end up essentializing, endorsing a way of talking about race that most people who are reasonably educated do not accept in talking about anybody else at this point. And so that's what in Christianity we call the eschatological reservation, right? That you have to, I think, sort of hold out for what the future of something could be, regardless of how unremittingly grim we may be about assessing what the past of this topic is.
So earlier both in the Crown Forum discussion and in Breaking White Supremacy, I believe, you highlight some of the figures that are associated with Morehouse.
Yes.
And I think one person, I don't think you mentioned him this morning, but I think you did in the book, Samuel Archer.
Yes.
He's not really talked about much in Morehouse history. So can you talk about Samuel Archer and his relationship with, I think it was John Hope?
Well, yes. I mean, Archer and Hope are contemporaries, and they, there's sort of, they are allies in the struggle, and take with just this epitome of moral seriousness the work of being an example to people, and of holding people up, and caring, but also just being strong, of being a model. So they're much alike in that regard. Although Archer is a much more sort of affable, character. I mean, John Hope was well, he had a job to do here. For Archer, he's a coach, and can be more of a rough and tumble sort of character. But they are contemporaries in a similar kind of work, and they were role models for Mordecai Johnson. Johnson is someone who needs to rebel. He had a very strict father, and there's a certain amount of acting out just needs to happen here for him to grow into who he's going to be. But at the same time, he desperately needed these 3 or 4 black male teachers in his life to respect him and to win their respect. And so they're very much, it's especially in that story that they come through so strongly. I should say there, the chapter on Mordecai Johnson is in some way, I mean, I have a special feeling about it, of just the work I was able to do on him. There's not nearly enough, there's hardly anything done on Johnson per se. There's a terrible irony about this, because he is out there every single week for decades speaking, and he's just one of the spellbinders. You get up there and say, well, the Lord didn't tell me how long to speak. The Lord called me to speak, but he didn't tell me for how long. And yeah, he could rattle on for 90 minutes, like this, and is just a kind of a missionary in the way he gives himself to the work. And yet he didn't write any of it down because he can just stand here and go with something. And so we have no texts at the end. And then the people who wrote about Johnson were all people who didn't like him at Howard University because he didn't pay them enough or whatever. He told them that last book wasn't very good or whatever it was, that incurred opposition to him. And so what we do have about Johnson mostly is the things that Rayford Logan and others said about him that were kind of putting him down. And so Johnson just has nowhere near the name, the recognition, the credit that is owed him. And this book, if nothing else, I hope that it makes some difference with regard to that. Thank you.
Yes. And you talked about Polly Murray a little bit,
Yes.
and how you kind of attend to a feminist perspective of the Black social gospel.
Yes.
At the end of the book. I'm trying to think about how you might have been able to attend to a queer perspective of the Black social gospel.
She was
especially in the fact that Paula Murray was queer, probably would best be defined as trans-identifying or trans-ish.
Right.
Now, is Pauli Murray the place where in which you attempt to map a genealogy of the queer key players in the Black social gospel?
Not really. No, I mean, on the genealogy, no, not on that. I do have her at the end because I just think, yes, she radiates to our time on certain subjects in certain ways like no one else that I've just talked about, and I think I've got to get there. Also, this helped me not to have her lost, to put her at the end and then put the whole thing there, and then really put in front of you, this is someone who's having to struggle her whole life as wondering, which thing was it that blocked me this time? And she doesn't know. But she knows it's never just one thing. Or, it isn't always just the same thing over and over. And so that perplexity of being intersectional and queer and lacking language for what she's dealing with just in dealing with herself. And writing about her family with just so magnificently, the way she did. But then also being able to be honest sort of about that, just being able to say, I can walk into rooms where I'm the lightest colored person in the room, and and I'm made to feel like I don't belong in the room. That's one of her issues. So just everything that we talk about today, and trying intersectional ways of talking about these topics, she just radiates through, and it's not with any need of sort of turning her into some pedestal figure that she wasn't. Because when she went to Brandeis, she did not deal well at all with the Black Power movement. She just couldn't deal with it. And she is that generation for whom, and this you just have to give it to this generation, for whom this was a deep injury when suddenly we can't use the word Negro any longer, which is a word that had been struggled for decades to be capitalized and isn't just a color word. And now it's being replaced with black. And to her, it's offensive. It hurts her in a place deep inside. It's because it just feels like the achievements of her generation are just being, denied, just washed away. Rayford Logan felt that way too. So she actually, for that reason and various others in that moment, that period she's at Brandeis did not go well at all, and has a very hard time admitting, in fact doesn't, that it's the Black Power movement that is making her now somebody that is actually giving her this platform that she wanted all these years and didn't have, and that she does admit when she takes the last passes at her own autobiography, when she has to assess her tendency to be too quickly critical of Black Power militants who are speaking a language that she doesn't speak and who are too confrontational from her standpoint to whatever, and yet a friend of hers points out, you don't have that problem with the militant feminists in our midst, and there are plenty of them, and we have all the same issues with them. Separatism and divisive language and, demonizing and whatever. All that stuff is going on there for the very same kinds of reasons. And there, you've got explanations out to here. You historicize all that, and you get it, put your arms around it, and so on. And yet over on this side, look at all the trouble you're having with black students at Brandeis who are just freaking out of their generational context. Well, she did, to her credit, she does, at least lets her friend, have that say. So, yeah, it's one of the things I love about her is that she's all that honesty, just trying to work on getting it right. And then, last of all, to find out rather late in her life that actually she's been on a spiritual journey all along that she didn't actually recognize. Pauli Murray thinks of herself as being basically secular. I mean, she's Episcopalian, right? So she's Episcopalian, she's in a hierarchical church, clerical church. Only priests are holy and women can't be priests unless you're one of those people who hangs out around the altar a lot and, takes care of church things. And she was never one of those kind of people. So she thinks of herself as not being religious because she's not clerical in that way, not churchy in that way. And so it takes her, this is after Dr. King is gone, where she recognizes, and this is partly it's the ecumenical movement and things that she's been pulled into, and her friend dying, and not being able to be a minister to her friend. But various things are making her realize, and this is after she's got a first draft of her autobiography, and the story of her life still isn't in there. She's still got a spiritual mission to her life, and so she quits Brandeis and goes to General Seminary when she's 63 years old to get an MDiv degree to go be a priest, which she was in her latter career. So, yes, I love it. Yes.
So, in writing this book, I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, but in writing this, did you come to see any strands of continuity between the Black social gospel movement, its theological implications, and what we now teach as liberation theology, which may have international connections, what be it South Africa or South America or
Yes.
everywhere else?
Yes. It has been one of my burdens for a long time, just to show the amount, so much of what's in liberation theology that we just identify as liberation theology that has actually been in social gospel all along, right? I mean, George Washington Whitby died 100 years ago, and yet, so much of it is there with him. Reverdy Ransom, Jim is one of my very dearest friends, Jim didn't know, I never heard of Reverdy Ransom when he wrote his early books. To him, certainly in his experience, there's just never been a theology that privileged black consciousness. He'd never heard of such a thing, and so he wrote right from that perspective. And he's not asking himself, well, how do I construe Alexander Walters or Reverdy Ransom or Ida Wells Barnett making this argument? He wasn't thinking, I think they might in some ways, be people in my line here. He didn't say that sort of thing at that time, but so clearly they were, right? Now, the point when Cone starts to rehistoricize all of that is in the mid-1980s, and when he did it, it had to do with Dr. King, right? This is now getting at, he had been ambivalent about King, and of course, Cone just hated what white liberals made of King, so that was, that was motivating for a long time. But when he gets into the period where now he's doing the research for what became the Martin and Malcolm book, he is claiming now, reclaiming what he would call the liberation theology that is so clearly in Martin Luther King that he hadn't claimed before, but certainly is there. And I think that's, you mind that's not just King, that's Mordecai Johnson, that's Benjamin Mays, that's Reverdy Ransom, that's Ida Wells Barnett. That's the new abolition, because it's abolitionism now being lived out in a different context in which slavery's come and gone, Reconstruction has come and gone, and now we got to ask, what would a new abolition be in this context? I think those questions do take you, and did, to liberation theology perspective. So this is something of a clue to why I ended where I did. Because now, if I have left room for a volume 3 for somebody, and you can just start with that moment, with that sort of Cohen moment. I mean, there's a lot about that in the last chapter of this book, but it quite clearly, I'm just simply put something in place, and I don't even follow Cohen all the way through. I very much just could have sort of cut it off about 1980 in this text, but I think. It's not, I'm grateful for this question, because it's not like I need to separate out one and the other. I think they go together. And to me, any progressive theology worth having, any revised liberal theology today needs to be a liberationist theology. That is a theology that asks liberationist questions. That's not to say that the old liberal questions are out. I do think, those questions about historical credibility and what we do with Darwinism and all that kind of thing, I think that has to be dealt with. So that does not displace or throw out that kind of liberal agenda. But I do think the idea of a liberal theology that just asks those old kind of liberal intellectual credibility questions and doesn't allow it to be judged and challenged and changed by liberationist questions, that just asks about how is any of this affecting people who have been oppressed and dispossessed by these very discourses and the culture around them. I think that has to happen, and it does. You could say someone like William Barber, you could just say, he's just straight out of the social gospel, but I don't see Barber as being something that Cone is not. To me, these come together, and then there are, in different ways, different strains.
The Dr. Dorrien has a 9-something flight. I think we planned to have you depart at 7. So, how many minutes do we have? 12. So that feels like that's more than 2 questions, maybe 1. This is the one over here.
Okay, I'm not seeing over here, so sorry.
I just wanted to say that I pretty much exposed Dr. King in this last part of his life. A lot of people have seen him as a dreamer, nice, poetic, but the frustration that he was going through in his own people. I like what you highlighted. Do you think that if he would have lived maybe 10 years beyond that point, what support he would have had with black leadership? Do you think we would have came back around and said we need to get behind him, or would he would have disappeared into relative with that group, that I don't know if they were, because his message started shifting. He was not the soft talker. He was moving into a different group.
Thank you. Firstly, you know, this shift starts pretty quickly after that. After that, I've got a dream thing. When those 4 church girls are killed just a few months later, it cut him. It just cut him to pieces. He just almost couldn't go on. He's in such despair, and said so. And that's when he starts to talk about just how sick this country is, right? And so that buoyant, dreamy talk is really just starts to drop out of his lectures, and people are asking for it, and that's just not how he feels. And then, you know, only a couple months after that, then President Kennedy is assassinated, and it's an extraordinary thing. Those of us who were around at the time, there was never a moment quite like that when the president was assassinated in the way he was, and people are walking around in this kind of slow motion mourning, and speaking in these hushed tones day after day. And yet, when Dr. King got back in the pulpit that Sunday, he preached a blistering sermon about racism without mentioning the great national mourning or the loss or even Kennedy being assassinated, which shows me something, right? That it's there are sort of layers to him, and something very deep in him sort of came out even in that moment. So there, you know, we're in November 1963. And he's starting to worry people around him as much as he is saying from that point onward, just talking about the deep sickness of this country and just not knowing how it can be dealt with. And then, of course, just the next year, in that spring, that summer is when finally Alex Haley tracks him down, gets him to sit down for 90 minutes. And if you've never read that Playboy interview in 1964, parts of it are just blistering. Including the talking about that you know it's begun to generate a rage in the Negro, right? That what's going on. So that turn is happening earlier than we tend to say. And if you read his last book, I mean, most of it is in fact a kind of explication of a Black Power analysis. What we're dealing with, but there's certain parts about how the Black Power movement is playing out that King is just going to say no to. Right? He's a Christian, and he also believes that there's a way of going politically. That is the way of despair. That's the way of flaming out with a despair that has no future. No revolution was ever like that, ever succeeded. And so holding the line on those two things, but most of all the rest of it is in fact a Black Power analysis about power as the ability to achieve a purpose, and arguing this is precisely what we need is indeed Black Power. That's it exactly. As for the future, well, we can't know. I mean, he was, as I just said briefly, he was unfathomably depressed and exhausted. Firstly, King is exhausted from about 1959 on. I mean, they just damn near killed him with the amount of he's out there, and it just the verdict keeps coming back that no one else can do this, can keep SCLC afloat. That it's just always on him to raise the money to do the next event, and every event means 4 or 5 because. Wherever he goes somewhere now, people light him up for extra things wherever he goes, and he is a deep kindness. I think he is a person of almost superhuman magnanimity, and so cannot say no. And all of it wore him down, and by the end he's so exhausted that he knows he needs to take a break. And so to try to picture a King beyond that moment of what we know he was like at the very end, first. He's just got to get a year off and go to Switzerland or teach at Union, which were the two things he talked about, and just take a break. And I talked to Jesse Jackson about this a couple months ago. He said, yeah, he thought maybe they were about to do it, that he had reached a point. They said one sign was just he's snapping out at people. King, who never snapped at anybody, was snapping, including at Jesse Jackson. And well, he deserved it in some ways. Right, that's right. So firstly, you've just got to imagine a set of circumstances. You know, he's got to get past where we are right now. But instead of that, of course, in the immediate context of what he's doing, as unfathomably depressed and exhausted as he is, what is he doing? Organizing a poor people's movement to Washington. So he can't find a way of taking what he knows he needs to do. But I think that whole episode only could have worked with him being there. Andy Young himself said he was only really willing to get arrested as long as he's getting arrested with Dr. King. And now after Dr. King is gone, he's really not up for this about what that next thing entailed. Only a couple months later. So by then we're into the madness of the 1960s. You just can't possibly sort of project beyond it. Of course, what did happen is people like Andy Young went into politics. And this is with knowing that he wouldn't have really cared for that. That he wanted his disciples to be doing, like what he was doing. And running for office might be kind of a sellout. There was that kind of back and forth did happen among them. And the fact that so many of them took that path, they all had a little bit of knowing that he probably wouldn't totally approve of this. And yet, I think, rightly saying, no, that actually is the path. That is the work. I mean, that does go with what I was saying today. I think that getting that balance, Christian love and the tools of coercion, I mean, that involves the work of politics. And politics often is not noble work, but politics needs to be noble work because there's no substitute for it. If people suffer because of politics and economics, then the church has to deal with politics and economics. Period.
Okay.
This visit, for me, Dr. Dorrien, is emotionally equivalent to when I invited this man to a full house in here for the National Black Seminary.